All right, welcome everyone to this episode of Healing Beyond Physical. And today I have a dear colleague of mine, Leah Demeta, who is here. Leah is someone that I met at the World of My Baby. We both work at this wonderful village. And Leah is a physiotherapist, a pelvic specializing in pelvic health as well, and a very compassionate soul. So I'm excited to have her as a guest here and for her to share her wisdom and her sacred transmission of her healing journey. So welcome, Leah. Thank you for being here today. And with that, I'm going to pause and invite you, Leah, to share with myself and those who will be tuning in as to healing beyond physical. What does that mean to you? And how did you arrive here?
Okay, thank you. Well, I just want to say thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to have this amazing conversation with you and everyone else who's listening. So, as you were mentioning, that I am a physiotherapist. And so I'm just going to talk a bit about my healing journey and kind of how it started and how I was able to reach to this point beyond the physical healing piece.
Mm-hmm.
So I was working actually at the hospital at the time, and it was now back 2 years ago, I want to say, well beyond 2 years ago, and I had hit my head at the top of a cabinet door. It was a very innocuous injury. And it was the day of a very busy schedule, and we know we're always go, 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 and really not thinking and taking that pause and breath. And so as a result of that, I sustained a concussion. It was the first time I ever got that label of a concussion. And I was first told, wait a few days, it should go away. And so I just stayed home, I rested, did what was told. And then they said, you should be able to go back to work on Monday, because it happened in the middle of the week. Monday came around and things started to feel worse. And I started to get scared. What is happening? What's wrong with me? Is there something seriously happening? And so I went back to my doctor and said, yes, it is a mild brain injury, concussion, and it can take time and to stay off. So there is an added layer to the recovery because it happened at work. And so there's these external factors as well from the insurance companies because it was a workplace injury.
Right.
So fast forward into kind of 2.5 months, things kind of over that period of time really started to get worse, in a sense where I'd been to the point where I was in a dark room. I was very isolated, couldn't really tolerate anything, felt very alone. I felt a loss of identity. So I was a very active person prior to this injury, just really social, was working lots and just loving my life. And I went from that to someone who isn't able to carry a conversation because it was so difficult from a cognitive perspective, to being in a room isolated and really just crying all the time. So it was a very difficult transition for me, and no one really telling me what to do and things to work on, but feeling like I really wasn't making any progress. And so once I reached that 3-month mark, they labeled it as post-concussion syndrome. And with that label, it's a very variable kind of being as to, what that looks like in the recovery. And so that really scared me. And I think going into that point, when I was 2 months, I feel like when you're recovering, you're always thinking like, okay, it's been one more month. And, that time, like you're counting. And I felt like that first period of my recovery was very much that way. And so after that point, I started to kind of realize that I had so much pressure that I was putting on myself, that I had to go back to work, that I had the insurance company saying I was a young female. Why wasn't I healthy and back to normal? There is a lot of these external and internal factors that I just didn't know what to do. And so feeling that I wasn't doing enough and I wasn't working hard enough. And it was challenging because I'm a very type A person. Being in the role that I am, to get to that point, you kind of have to be. And so it's very driven that, I got to do X, Y, and Z and kind of all these things. And I found that because of my personality as well, it almost made the recovery harder because I continued to have all these kind of beliefs and things that I needed to do. And I started to recognize that doing more wasn't helping, pushing more wasn't helping. And go ahead.
I was going to say, I really want to pause on that one because that's such a big one, right? Because doing more and taking action is purposeful. And in terms of having you move into a place where you could receive your designation and have a practice as a physiotherapist, it was really needed, right? Like that focus and the ability to keep going on. And when it comes to recovery or healing, all of a sudden there is, that same desire comes in because through life we've kind of learned to, work hard, push hard to get results. If you go to the gym, again, if you are trying to build muscle or kind of work with your cardio goals, whatever, it's like work hard, push hard. And now there is a huge unlearning that you're sharing that happens when it comes to healing, because that mindset is almost a detriment to healing when we put that pressure on ourselves and expect that we needed results yesterday. And what's fascinating to me as you were sharing is, of course, then the not enoughness shows up. Because then the narrative somehow is, I must not be doing enough, if I'm not seeing results. And that can be a very humbling place, right? Where when you are a type A person who is used to getting amazing results, and then we come to this point where it's like, why am I not able to move this needle forward? So I can deeply relate to this, and I feel like the audience and our listeners are going to deeply relate to this because we do live in a society that is celebrated, that celebrates hustle culture, that celebrates busyness. And it's almost like busyness equals productivity, or you're being so productive when you're so busy, right? I mean, usually when we talk, it happens so innocently when we say, oh my God, I'm so busy. And that is, and then it sort of propagates, because then the other person who's not busy feels like, well, I must be lazy.
Not doing enough.
I'm not doing enough. So I wanted to pause and unpack that a little bit, because I feel like this is something that shows up a lot. Especially, and I can speak to women, given both of us collaboratively also support women, that I'm not doing enough is such a big one. And the guilt, the shame that comes about when we need to somehow slow down. And I just want to say and acknowledge for whoever is feeling that as they're listening, like, it's not you doing this to yourself on purpose. It's a belief system that's so ingrained in us. It's your subconscious mind taking over.
Our culture.
Yeah, our culture, our patriarchal society, and the values that it celebrates. It's all about the going and the action and the competition. So
amen to that. Yes.
So I just want to say, I hear you, Leah, and I hear the voices of all the women who are listening to this, who might be saying, yes, I too feel this way, or I have felt this way. So
for sure.
Listening. Thank you for saying that, and even having the courage to share that, Leah.
And I think coming to that reflection took me a while. And with that was the acceptance, where, accepting my injury and acknowledging that, okay, I do have a concussion, and, I need to take a step back and work at a pace that my body and brain's telling me. I think that was a big turning point and catalyst for me to start to recognize that there's a lot more to this than just, okay, my physical injury, which was also invisible, which is another added layer to everything. But there is so much more beyond, what's happening at my neck and all those
Yeah.
pieces.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that acceptance, I feel that I
Acceptance.
was like, why did this happen to me?
Yes.
Why me? Will I ever get better? Like those were the
Mm.
questions that I kept lingering in my
Yeah.
head. And it was very difficult to accept it, acknowledge it, and be okay with it through the rest of my journey. And I found as I started working with you and really kind of working through these kind of emotions and feelings and thoughts, I was able to, and the psychologist to kind of use certain
Mhm.
techniques as well. I was able to harness that and use that in a way to move forward.
Mm.
It was very powerful.
It is, and acceptance is such a simple word, right? Like when you say, I accept. And I want to unpack that a little bit for our listeners, because Leah, from your experience, tell me when, can we just cognitively say I accept, and does that happen? Or is it an embodied experience? And, what does the embodiment look like? Is it like one moment and boom, everything changes? What is that like? Because I think for listeners who are on this journey and kind of getting curious about, okay, perhaps it's acceptance that I need to invite, you
Mm-hmm.
know, through your experience, I would love for them to hear and receive.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think that it's an ongoing process. Like I'm still working through my journey, and there's better days than others. And I always say better is better,
Yes.
but it recovery is never linear, and we know that.
Mhm.
And with that comes the
Mhm.
acceptance. And there's
Mhm.
days that you are okay and great with this, and then there's days where you crash really hard and you were doing so great, and then you're like, oh no, is it back? Is it worse? Am I going to get
Yes.
better? And then it's
Yes.
like, how do I accept this now? Like I'm doing everything right.
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
the more you go and the more tools and strategy you have, the better it is. But it's very dynamic. The whole recovery process is dynamic, and as you're changing, your thoughts and emotions are changing, everything around you is changing. So it's definitely not a one in moment time. That sounds so much easier than it is, and
Yes,
it's a lot of work.
it is.
um, but it definitely like allows your body to feel safe to go through
Mhm.
that journey, and that's a constant journey in itself.
Yes, yes. And that's so key when you said it's not linear.
No.
Because again, as soon as we approach it with that, there's going to be disappointment. And then the failure, and I'm not doing enough,
Yep.
comes in so quickly. Rather, what if this is not a linear journey, just like you said? What if there are going to be ebbs and flows? And then how do I speak to myself during the valleys? That's where I want to go next, because what happened in your journey, Leah, when, because you've clearly in your journey had many moments where you felt like you were in that dark tunnel, whether it was literally a dark room or
Yeah.
kind of metaphorically speaking, a dark space.
Mm-hmm.
And then this inner voice gets so loud. And I'm curious as to how it showed up initially and how that's shifted, and how did that move for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that inner dialogue was so key. And I feel that at first I didn't even recognize that I had it. It was like subconscious, like
Mm-hmm.
it's just how you talk to yourself. And
Yes.
when you start to like reflect and kind of tune into those deeper parts of kind of your emotions and beliefs, you're like, wow, like I'm that mean to myself. And I remember doing this exercise where it's, okay, if someone was you, what would you tell them?
Mm-hmm.
And then what would you tell yourself? And
Yes.
it's so different, when you what you would say to someone versus if you were to say what you say to yourself to someone, right? And I was like, oh wow, I'm really not nice to myself. And so that inner dialogue, I started to recognize it. And again, it's a process. Like it's till this day, there are still times, because I am so hardwired and have been
Mm-hmm.
brought up in such a certain manner
Mm-hmm.
to think outside of that. But
Mm-hmm.
it's the compassion that comes with that, and the acceptance,
Mm-hmm.
and being this loving kindness where you are happy with wherever you are. And even if it's not a good day, acknowledging what you have done
Mm-hmm.
and being okay with that. It's okay to have bad days. It's okay to have rest. Rest is good.
Mm-hmm.
And so bringing more of that like mindfulness, self-compassion, and again, that took and is still taking a lot of practice. But I think that was a really big piece that, again, with everything else that I mentioned, once I started to really like feel that I was doing my best, regardless of what that looked like to other people and what they thought, because I think that's a big piece too, I was able to do more because I gave myself that space and I gave myself this lovingness that I didn't have, which is so key in order to actually move forward. It was like a block that I didn't know was there.
Yes.
And it's like, I'm chipping away and moving all these bricks. And I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know those things were all there. But yeah, I think that like compassionate piece and, you know, what you say to yourself, knowing and unknowingly, was such a powerful part of it too.
Right. Right. And clearly, like you said, then it's that moment to moment awareness. And that's where that mindfulness muscle can really serve in just recognizing that, oh, there is this conversation, first of all, happening. And that is not my identity. These thoughts are not me. It's like a movie playing. And then consciously finding ways, strategies, building skills as to how do I shift from that place when that inner voice is just so loud, right? And it's repetition and practice. And I know from witnessing you that you have been doing a lot of that. There's a lot of behind the scenes that someone will never know.
Yes.
In your healing journey and how it means to show up for ourselves, really. Right. Like as I keep hearing you share your journey, it's like you had to keep saying yes to you versus to the external like voices of like, you know, maybe it's like, when are you going to come back? Or the insurance company making you feel like somehow you're not doing enough, you know, you're so young, like that narrative. And then sort of setting that boundary and saying, no, this is what I need. And it's okay. It's safe to slow down.
Yeah, boundaries. Oh my God, that word means so much to me in so many ways with my recovery. Because if you don't realize how important it is to have boundaries, and it's okay to say no. I am definitely a people pleaser, and I am so likely to say yes to everything. And prior to this concussion, I would just, you know, go with it. And I was okay and I was managing. But with the recovery, I recognized that I needed to be kinder to myself. And part of that was the boundaries. And, you know, it's okay to say no. And, you know, you don't need to explain yourself, but if you want to, you can. And to have that time for pacing and planning if it's an energy issue, if it's, you know, just to have a moment to just like decompress through your day, whatever boundaries means to who you are, they are so important. And again, I don't think I really ever had that. And it's a skill that it's like a silver lining. Like I'm almost grateful because I've learned such an important skill, so many others too, but that I still work through and I still use now all the time. And I don't think it's really ever taught well.
Yes. Boundaries, right? Again, a very simple word, and it's an embodied experience. And like you said, it's that gift that came wrapped in sandpaper, right? Your experience. I mean, we wish for no one to have that experience. Yet in those moments of challenge and or pain and deep sort of, you know, where you really feel broken on the inside, it appears that we feel that way, like something just kind of, you know, has exploded in our heart and it's in like many little pieces. In that state of vulnerability, there is so much potential.
So true.
So much potential if and when we are ready to get curious and wonder, what if this is not here to punish me or to, you know, for me to suffer? Rather, what if this is just here to bring me home to this version of myself that I truly am, that I just need to reconnect with. And that's why then boundaries. And when you said I was a people pleaser and didn't even know boundaries, like what a gift to know the relevance of boundaries, because this is going to serve you for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And we could look at it as, through a dark lens and say, oh my God, and I couldn't do this and I couldn't do that and this happened. And yes, those are all very real, right? We want to acknowledge that grief and also get curious about what else. But what else is coming with this experience?
Right.
How is it helping me grow as a loving person and really loving myself? Because that's what I keep hearing as you're sharing. Yeah. You're returning home to yourself. You're saying no.
Exactly. And it's so funny. Anyone who's listening who's had a concussion, I think a huge piece of it is this invisible illness.
Yes.
And there's so many others. It's not just a concussion. And so I feel that you say validation, and that's so important because I felt so much at the beginning, this lack of validation that I had to prove to others, like, this is what I'm living with.
Right.
And because I was constantly trying to prove, because people couldn't see, I didn't have a cast, I didn't have crutches, I didn't have anything. They thought I was just weird. I don't know what they thought.
It's all in your head, Leah.
Exactly.
Right?
And so once I started to realize that, okay, I'm just going to validate within and with those who understand and kind of give myself that loving compassion, then things started to really change. And I think that piece was so important. But I felt like that's like, we kind of talked about the after, which is great. But when I was going through that process, I feel that invisibility was so hard for me. And being a physio and going through that process is, like you're used to having like actual physical problems.
Yes.
And so even for myself, as I was trying to understand it, but I think that was a big piece. And, being heard and validated by the right people was so important. And that helped me to also validate, this is real and this is me. And when I'm going through it is okay. And, taking those slow steps.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to deeply acknowledge that for our listeners, that piece, I can relate to it tremendously, Leah, because I know I've shared this with you in the past, that when you shared about your concussion, I felt called to tell you about my own journey because I kind of went through it silently. And just like yourself, there was a lot of like, I'm failing as a mom, because for me, my concussion happened when I had a little baby who needed me, but I couldn't even carry him because I get, overrun by the sensations. And again, to the external world, everything else was working like physically, right? It was all there. And at the same time, it wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I didn't have access to the ability to even feel safe to stand by a railing and look over.
Yes.
That overwhelmed me in a way that I had never even experienced. And then you start feeling nauseous, and there's so many layers. Like, I remember my boys used to play hockey back then, and I remember going to a game, and I felt so sick just standing and trying to look over at them as they were skating. I couldn't take it. And I felt so sick that it took me a few days to recover from that. And it can feel so lonely when we're moving through these experiences. And you being here, sharing your story, is that voice for those who feel like they're suffering in silence. Even if it's not a concussion, like you said, there are many invisible, disease or invisible challenges that we're moving through that don't have a physical component. And the path to healing across all of them needs a layer of, you're right, you're not alone. I feel you, I hear you. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was just telling you before we hopped on the call that, so for those listening, so it was a year and a half And I had gotten to a place with all these pieces that have helped me tremendously in just who I am as now. And I was at a place where I was very happy, and I had made tremendous progress with a lot of my goals. And I was still working towards some higher end goals, as you know, I like to do lots of activities and
Yes.
sports and dancing.
Why not?
And just living, right?
Yes.
Why not get back to the things
Yes.
you love to do? But I sustained a second concussion at work again. Yet this happened in November, and where I am now, 3 months after, versus where I was 3 months with my first one, are so different. And I think there's a lot of valuable skills and tools and things I learned along the first time that has served me so well this time around, which is why this recovery has been so different for me. Yes, I still have ways to go, but I'm way more okay with it and constantly referring to, it's okay, like where I am is good, and giving myself that lovingness that we all know is so important. And I'm just so happy with where I am. Yes, it's not where I want to be, but it's still a step forward. And those little steps add up in the end.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that, Leah, because first of all, I remember when I heard about your injury the second time, my heart went out to you, because I mean, that is just sort of like there's a level of, stress or trauma imprint that we hold when we move through it, and then sort of just experiencing it again. It's like all those worlds come back really fast. What's so inspiring to hear is how this time, because you have been doing your work of coming home to yourself and walking that path of love, that you were able to navigate it without feeling like it was over, or getting to that point where many of us can get stuck, where we just feel hopeless. And it's like, why even bother? Why even try?
Yes.
Right? I mean, I have felt that in my journey. I've heard voices of other women I support in their journey, but there is such a helplessness and a hopelessness. And I would say, if that's the voice you're hearing, it's just a voice that's calling us home to find that path of love. Because as soon as we start walking that path, and with whatever support we need, we'll move forward. So that, I want to pause and acknowledge that. And the other big thing, as you were sharing, Leah, was when you said, this happened the second time, and you were able to kind of keep giving love to yourself, and recognizing the progress that you had made until date, then knowing that I don't have to wait till this goes away to be happy or to be joyful. Like, I just want to say that very loudly, and I'll keep saying it in every episode, because I so often hear that. I've heard myself say it early on in my journey, and I've heard that mirrored by women that I support. I'm sure you've heard that. It's like, okay, when this is gone, then I will be happy again, and then I will be able to do X, Y, Z. Until then, somehow we've convinced ourselves that we can't live in duality, that we can't live with what we have and come into acceptance, because I think that's that missing piece. And so we're fighting it and, waiting for it to go away, rather than embracing it and saying, okay, and now where is joy?
Yes.
Where can I find happiness while having this really challenging experience in my life right now?
Yeah. That's so important, because and for myself, like I said, like I loved dancing. Dancing was something where I felt present and I was happy and I loved it. But with my concussion, I couldn't even tolerate walking very much, never mind the spinning that comes with it. But I was able to find joy in new things that I had never thought about before, like painting. Oh my God, so therapeutic, and something I did with my partner. And so I started to learn that, yes, there's a piece of me that isn't where I want to be, but that doesn't mean I can't enjoy life, and that there's still so much I can do. And that has been so different this time around from exactly those pieces, where I have still been able to have some of that socialization and do things in a modified way, but that bring me that joy, because laughter and joy is so important for everyone. And I felt like I didn't have any of that for like 6 months in my first concussion.
Mm.
It was such a
Mm.
dark place.
Yeah.
So I'm so happy you brought that up, because that's so true.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just creating space for whoever's listening, that if you're relating to this, and if this is sort of bringing stuff up in your heart where you're like, oh my God, I can relate. I have been waiting, to be kind to yourself. It's okay. Like Leah said, she did spend a certain amount of time, and part of that experience then kind of opens us up, because when it gets so dark and when we feel so broken, wounded, the light enters. It's through the
Yes.
wound that the light can enter. So that space of vulnerability is the space of great shift. If there's a way that our subconscious can be reprogrammed, there are different ways, but one way that they know that it gets reprogrammed is when we go through a really life-altering experience. And all of a sudden, we can just shift into a whole new trajectory, a different way of being kind to ourselves, setting our boundaries, bringing in compassion towards us, speaking to ourselves the way we would speak to others. And so I just want to say that it's okay for our listeners, if you feel like you've been stuck in that space, it's okay. It's okay. I think I was in that space for 3 years. So I feel there is no timeline. And maybe you listening to this conversation can be that seed that your consciousness needs today.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah. So I celebrate you, Leah, for, keep that, how you're showering yourself with love, and how you're finding other ways to bring joy into your life, and really arriving and living life. We don't have to stop living our lives just because we have whatever diagnosis we have received. And sometimes it's not even a diagnosis. Sometimes it's a life experience, right? Like we're going through a separation or the loss of a loved one. It can look different for everyone. And at the core, it brings up many of the similar sort of feelings of, feeling alone, and wanting or feeling like we need to wait till this is over to start living again.
Yeah. And I feel the more like the little pieces you start to feel, it like adds.
Yeah.
And then you're like, wow. And so it's just, and then it's inspiring, and then you even more and more, and that helps with the recovery and the loving, and it creates this positive kind of cycle, which we all benefit from. So for sure.
Absolutely. So, Leah, I'm curious in where you are today then, and the skills, tools that are supporting you. What are there a couple of practices or just kind of seeds of wisdom that you want to share here for our listeners who, wherever they are in their healing journey, might just give them that opportunity to get curious and say, oh, okay, because I feel like each of us heal beyond the physical through different paths. And you brought up art, which is, wonderful. I didn't use art therapy in my healing, and at the same time, now I'm really drawn to it. So, there's a time, place for different, but I'd love to know a couple of things that have really served you. And, any words of wisdom that you have, that you feel called, that you want to just put out there for our listeners.
Yeah. I will say with that, before I dive into specifics, it's the capacity. Because one lesson that I learned is at the beginning, I felt like I needed to see 10 different people for all these things.
Yes.
And then you're like seeing all these appointments, and you're just drained. Like that's a whole life and like a job in itself. And so I noticed that, there's a time and a place for certain people and certain practices.
Yes.
And so I think that's really important, because sometimes you just dive into everything.
Yes.
And it's recognizing your capacity at that time.
Absolutely.
And so through certain points in my recovery, I did certain practices or worked with certain people, which have brought me to where I am today. And I think the second time around, that was a big piece, is not overwhelming myself with that too. So just like an overarching piece that I learned through that.
Thank you for saying that, Leah. That is a very important lesson. Yes to that.
Yeah. As for certain things that stick out to me, I think a big piece was learning mindfulness, self-compassion, the actual practice of it. And there's a variety of different activities and sessions that I worked through. Some of that was with you and your yin yoga, which I found powerful, because there was a slight movement component, but it was very gentle, which is what my body needed. And I took other kind of seminar type workshops around that area to dive into that deeper. Art, as I mentioned, was for someone who physically was very challenging to work through. It was a really nice way to just let your emotions and be creative and tap into yourself. There was something so therapeutic, which I had never done before. So I really loved that piece too. And I think having the support, like having some key people in your life who understand and you can reach to, the social aspect and that love and support does help facilitate within. So it's not about how many people you have around you, but who you have around you. And so who that is depends on your journey and where you are. And at certain points in my journey, there are different people. But I think that was a really important piece for me as well.
I love that. Thank you for that. And acknowledging two things that, in a different podcast, I'll come back to what you brought up, Leah, when you said capacity, understanding or capacity, and then sort of choosing where can I go from here, wherever we are. And, then we get curious about like, well, how do I learn that? And my intention is making notes. It's like, okay, maybe I will unpack that in a future episode about like, what does that mean? And how do we learn to relate and kind of listen to our bodies and understand what we have capacity for? And the other piece, I'm losing my thought on the second one, but I think just giving ourselves permission to have that social connection is really important. And I feel like, again, that could be many conversations about the role of community and connection and surrounding yourself with those that are going to uplift you. It's like you said, it's not the quantity, it's the type of person you are choosing to bring into your realm. Because we're constantly receiving and giving. And that's an energetic boundary to me. I sort of see it through the realm of energetic boundaries and whose energy am I going to allow in my space. And sometimes I would say it's like choosing the energy that aligns and also thinking of it as what other ways is that coming into my life. So if I'm following on social certain people whose energetic imprints are depleting me, I kind of need to recognize and almost do an energetic inventory on, right? Because quite often in our healing journeys, we find that we just have no energy. Right? You've been there.
I felt like I zero energy, like stuck on a bed, couldn't even do stairs. Like I just and like emotionally, cognitively, like there was just no energy when I started. Definitely.
Yeah. So then I'm going to leave it at that, and maybe there will be another episode on how to do that. But that energetic boundary is going to be so important. Who you let in and who you say, not now.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Amazing.
I am so loving our conversation, and I'm smiling because there was just so much wisdom there in our conversation today. And, Leah, you have such a gentle spirit. And I'm just grateful for you bringing this part of you here in this conversation today. To our listeners, I thank them for being part of this conversation whenever this is going to be for them. And to know that I'm going to share Leah's information in terms of how you can connect with her. If you are curious to learn about what is pelvic health physiotherapy and this amazing work that Leah does, reach out to her, and all that information will be in the show notes. So there will be a way for you to connect to Leah. Leah and myself were based in Ontario. One of the clinics where both of us work together is in Milton. So just based on where you're located. But I also know Leah is also on social. So there are many ways to connect with her. And I'm going to put all that into the show notes. So there's a way for them to reach out and get curious with you, because in my final sort of what I'm going to say with closing is, I'm a true believer that when we're walking the path of healing, to invite those alongside of us, those that have had embodied experiences. Because when you've been through the really dark places, there is a level of compassion that gets cultivated that just is there. I don't have to think about compassion. It will just flow for you. It just flows, right? Like you see another, you hear them, you feel them, and it just flows. And that goes beyond again what meets the eye in terms of all the designations a person can have, because there can be so many pelvic physios, there can be so many everything, right? And to really attune to that in our healing journeys, and to find those people who can walk alongside us. Yeah, so that's where I'm going to close and say thank you so much, Leah, for sharing your time today with me. And so much love to you on your healing journey of healing beyond physical. And it's so inspiring to hear how you've truly embodied compassion through this label of concussion and post-concussion syndrome, all those labels. And beyond that, there was so much deeper that's happening, and that's beautiful to witness. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on here. It almost just like, it feels so therapeutic just talking about it. And I'm so passionate about this area, like you said, having gone through this embodied experience. And for anyone who needs to just, have someone who's, okay, I'm not alone.
Yes.
I am there because I know how it feels.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you so much. And so much love to you.
You too.